is a projection 16mm onto sculptures, curved surfaces, working with shadows. I mean, actually, this feeds into quite a bit of work now that we're doing with Connect, and also superimposition was particularly interesting. And this little bit about Tim, and I probably will ask Tim to say something because I'm not going to remember all. These were the singing squibs. Yep. So Tim was doing, please,
programming.
Yes.
Video effects, so layering computer imagery on top of video. This is at Art College about 20 years ago. And in particular, the ones on the left are actually a sort of an artificial life system. So the small dots are the food, the squares are creatures that move around. Squibs, I call them, square beings. So if they hit enough food, they get bigger and they make musical notes. Which is not a million miles away from some of this piece here in particular, where the things are moving around looking for colours. So 20 years later, it's still doing the same thing.
And what were you programming then?
Oh, that would be Amiga. It was on an Amiga, so there's a sort of basic, some variation of basic language programming.
So Tim was also working with video and editing it and fiddling with it and animation as well. So both of us interested in the moving image, but Tim working heavily with programming and me thinking very much about working in a space and the audience being able to move around the space. So in 2000, I set up a group called geneticmoo, which was a film and performance group, and at its height it had 10 members in it, which again, bringing different skills and lots of equipment to the table, so it meant that we could all help each other work on film projects, but also develop projects together. The final piece we made, and we said it killed us, was Feral Beasts. It was our attempt to make a feature film, and it had 3 directors and far too many cooks, so I think it took 2 years to make. The feature film became 22 minutes, but I still think it's a fine piece of work, and I think you can find it on the internet. But we did animation projects, performance projects with films, etc., and we had a lot of fun. And then I went on to do an MA at Middlesex University at the John Lansdowne Centre, did a bit of basic programming, started working on the Starfish, and then Tim and I decided to combine our skills to move into doing interactive installations. So, very important text for me in 2006 was I discovered this article talking about where humans come from, our relations, and one of the things that captured my imagination was, and of course it was the authors, the way the journalist wrote it, he talked about starfish once having brains, and that they had evolved, they had decided, if you like, that the brain wasn't so important. So of course they still had a nervous network. But it was this idea of when everyone's thinking about humans becoming more cerebral, and therefore the head becoming so very important, that here was a creature that actually had moved away from that. And I was also fascinated by the lack of faces, if you like, in the work. So I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if humans were inspired by a more sensual evolution, an evolution to a more, I mean, I was always fascinated by the amoeba, but just moving around your space. It's a bit acid, it's a bit alkaline, whatever. So also an interesting food as well. So early works that Tim and I worked on together were the starfish. We also created a squirt piece. These are sea squirts. They are regarded as animals, but they have the cellulose skin walls, so I'm getting pushed on. So the very first version of this was the starfish. My sister gave me a crown full of starfish, and I was interested in being a little bit playful with it, and I looked at it and I thought, well, that definitely looks a bit breasty, and if I'm thinking about the sensual world and what we move into, then it makes sense that you think about the parts of the body that are sensitive. So this was a photograph that was actually 4 or 5 foot across that we exhibited in an exhibition, and then from there I went to Middlesex and said, okay, I'd like to turn this into an interacting creature. So a little bit about our early work. So the starfish was a very playful creature. People could interact with it with their body, move around. It was, as you can see from this gives you an idea of what's going on behind it. and it took, people spent a long time trying to work it out, and that kind of wasn't the point, you know? We weren't interested in people sort of working to levels like you do in games, and just feeling that they'd encountered something unusual and strange. Nevertheless, it's really important to work through this, to actually have concepts of our creatures having some sort of movement, behaviour, and states. Myron Kruger, Tim introduced me to him. I mean, he was hugely important for the 1950s doing computer interactions, working with NASA, was it?
70s,
Yeah,
with our IBM
some,
mainframes.
yes, with, and one of the things that we're particularly interested in him was, again, the playful nature of what he was doing. So the audience being invited to play with the works. He didn't actually regard himself as an artist, but he's incredibly influential within computer arts. And also the generative arts. This is imagery of William Latham. We put it in because we've talked about creating digital ecology, so an environment where things are feeding off each other and hopefully growing. So another nature, an influential artist for us. And Nicola, biologist, a scientist, an illustrator, and drawing the very creatures that we're particularly interested in. But huge, very, very beautiful illustrations, and guiding us in pattern making within our creatures, because things like starfish and urchins are pentaradial, so not having this bilateral symmetry, but this circular symmetry. And so it informs our creature making, because even though they hopefully are a little bit disturbing, because you think you know what they are, and then you look at them and you think, hang on a minute, that's, I think I recognise that bit. Hopefully at the same time there is a certain beauty in them. So this is the animalcule, one of our works. And this was the first time we'd actually worked with a flock of creatures. Very simple, torch-driven interaction into a pool where you could actually draw them up from the depths. And we now have, I think, maybe 37 different creatures in the piece. But whenever we show it, we look at what fauna is in the area and then consider adding that to it. So we did a show with Furtherfield, and they have a pond near where they're based that has green lichen and algae, and so we introduced that into the mix as well. So we're sort of taking on board where the pieces are shown. And then Mother, which started off as an interactive piece but is now run mainly as a generative piece. So this is where the first time, in the past then it was all human body parts making our creatures. This was the first time we actually introduced some animal. Of course the animal matter was dead, octopus, prawns, tripe, etc. And I was doing a residency in Camberwell and had the opportunity to use their photographic labs and was able to use things like hair dryers and liquid to basically animate this dead matter. And so it brings together this, well, it hopefully says something about our animal status, you know, that humans always think, I'm not an animal, or there is that tendency not to connect with that animal state. So there's reference to that. We called it Mother, but we were imagining this as the progenitor of all our creatures. This could be where our starfish, urchin, animalcules came from. Growth line. So it did actually create creatures here. This was the first time we really explored shadow play, so it's pre-working with Connect. A very, very intuitive interaction. You can imagine you walk into the space, you see your shadow, and you can see the line bend with it. And it sort of, I suppose, it supported our developing understanding that it can be a remarkable experience for someone discovering their connection with the work, but not feeling they have to understand something about it. So you don't need to have specialist knowledge, you don't need to be a game player to actually enter this space and actually work with it. And the mutoscope, which is one of our pieces over here, this is, I suppose, extends that because it's driven by a handle. So it's using tools like torches or handles or shadows, which people are obviously very comfortable with using.
We'll be showing Growthline in this coming week,
Yeah.
somewhere in the space. So.
Yeah. And it's alive. We have had it running. This was something for anyone who's heard of Exploding Cinema. We were resident artists with Exploding Cinema for 2 years. And we created a piece that parasitically fed off their projection screen. So with Exploding Cinema, anyone can submit a film to Exploding Cinema and it is guaranteed to be shown as long as it's under 26 minutes. That's the only proviso. And so what we had was basically a web camera pointing at their projection screen. So if you imagine that's the screen, taking the information, so specifically light and colour, and then feeding it into a program and playing it back on another wall. And we never got criticised for actually sucking that information out of the film, but it was a liberty, let's say, in some of the works that were being shown. And then a really important moment perhaps for us in recent times is a collaboration with Sean Clark, who's going to be doing a talk today. This imagery comes from Symbiotic, which is a show that we had in Leicester at Phoenix Square in the Q Gallery, and it was based on conversations we had about how can we get a relationship, a communication between our artworks. So not just the audience, if you like, talking or working with the artwork, but the artworks themselves feeding off each other. And for those of you who've read about this show, you'll understand that this is an extension and it's something that we hope to develop further with Sean. And an image, this is just to show some of the creatures we were imagining inhabiting this space. So this is work in progress. Some of these creatures are already in existence. This is a sketch really, but it was imagining the human avatar in connection with creatures that, let's say, have a realistic quality with the highly graphic quality of dots of coral. And on the wall over there, you've got these red mods, just like a clashing of aesthetics and seeing how that might work in our installations. So that is it. If anyone has any questions about what I've talked about or about the show, please feel free to ask. I hope, is that all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so does anyone want to ask any questions or like to explore any ideas? Or?
Michael,
yes.
How was Kinect changing your image about?
Let's say we work with it carefully because an expression that Tim uses, it has this very strong signature of the silhouette. I mean, on the one hand, people who are familiar with it, especially youngsters, know that as soon as they're in that space, they can do something with it. But it's if you're not careful, it's quite a limiting thing. So it was interesting to go from shadows to working with Kinect. So I would say we're developing an understanding or a relationship with it, but we've explored the silhouette aspect of it. We've also worked with the webcam side of it. So anyone who was in here earlier before we set up, we use the webcam to record what it sees to actually provide data for the creatures. But then people also can enter the space and swim around it with their silhouette. So it sort of adds something to it. But I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're working with it carefully at the moment because it does have such a strong signature.
And you like saying that you've got to restrict the user to a limited window so they don't destroy your artwork?
Oh, I don't even feel like that. I think because it's content. Something I was saying earlier was that in interactive art, if you're not careful, the complete focus is on the interaction. And we really want to have rich content. We want people to have something to take away. So perhaps in this case with these works, I've hinted at this imagined future human evolution. So that those sort of ideas going on in your head. But no, in fact, what we would like to do is create an open play situation for people to explore, because it's really fantastic if people do things that surprise us, and it does happen that people in exploring the boundaries actually discover things that they weren't or we weren't expecting. In a case in point was this, which was a webcam, in fact. But we had, so it's alive, it was shown in the Old Vic tunnels, and people could use a torch to, it looked virtually drill through a wall and reveal maggots. What happened was kids came into the space as a hanging torch and started using it as a graffiti tagging device, which was, really fun. So I would say, and I think the other thing was actually having multiple users. That's really important. We really don't want to say to people, only one person can go into a space, which in the past was quite typical of interactive art, and I think that's opening up more. But as far as possible, we want a multiple user experience.